How's it going, everyone? 2025 is just around the corner, and many are wondering, what will the new year bring? Well, there's a theory that human history works in cycles of 80 years. We're going to explore this theory and see what it can predict about the future. It's a fascinating approach because it takes what's really a physics tool called a characteristic timescale and applies it to the study of history. A characteristic timescale is a unit of time measurement which is somehow naturally related to the phenomena being studied. For example, if someone is studying work projects, a characteristic timescale may be 7 days because work is arranged in 7-day cycles, 5 work days followed by 2 rest days. The idea that history moves in 80-year cycles is often attributed to William Strauss and Neil Howey, who developed this concept specifically with a focus on American history, although others have worked with this concept as well. So, why does 80 years make sense as a characteristic timescale for human history? Well, first off, 80 years is approximately a human lifespan. Of course, this number varies greatly, but if we wanted to build a simple mathematical model, 80 years is not an unreasonable value to use. Half of 80 is 40, which is approximately the age after which women stop having children. Of course, this varies as well, but again, for a simple mathematical model, it is a reasonable number. Half of 40 is 20, which is typically the age by which people reach their maximum height. It takes 20 years approximately for one to develop from birth to adulthood. And half of 20 is 10, which is approximately the age at which children begin puberty. Now, of course, all of these values vary, but for a simple mathematical model, they are all reasonable values to use, and it's quite interesting to observe that each value comes from dividing the previous value by 2. So, if we imagine a world where everyone reaches puberty at 10, they reach adulthood, their maximum height, by 20, women have had all of their children by 40, and everyone's lifespan is 80, what would we observe? As someone moves from 0 to 80, the girls who were born the same year as them will have had all of their children, and the youngest daughters of those girls would have also had all of their children. One would also see in that 80-year span 4 eras of children being born and turning into adults, because 80 divided by 4 is 20. So there would be 4 different such periods that are not overlapping, during which children are born and become adults. Now, is there any evidence to suggest that in an 80-year period there would be 4 distinct generational cultures? Well, let's take a look. 80 years ago was 1945. And since then, we've had the baby boomers from the mid-40s to the mid-60s, Generation X roughly from the mid-60s to the mid-80s, Millennials from the mid-80s to the early 2000s, and Gen Z from the early 2000s up until now, just before 2025. The children being born now are not Gen Z. They're called Gen Alpha. Why Alpha? Well, Z is the end of the alphabet, so we go to the start of the alphabet. But Z and Alpha are different alphabets. Z is English and Alpha is Greek. So on one hand, we see the start of a new cycle, but on the other hand, it's a different cycle. It's a different alphabet, which relates to the phrase that history doesn't exactly repeat, but it does rhyme. So, a good way to look at where we are in history is to look at what was going on 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and 80 years ago. So let's do exactly that. We'll take a journey back in time, starting from the end of 2024, soon to be 2025, and go back from there. So, 10 years ago was 2014, soon to be 2015. The President of the United States was Barack Obama, although soon Donald Trump would become the main focus of American politics. Justin Trudeau was about to become the Prime Minister of Canada. The Ukrainian Maidan Revolution had recently happened, and the Syrian civil war started not too long ago. For most people, these are relatively recent developments in human history. But to children who are just reaching puberty around now, this was their entire world. Trump was always on the front page of American politics. Trudeau was always the Prime Minister of Canada. Ukraine and Russia were always in some form of conflict. And Syria was always in civil war. So that's 10 years ago. Let's go to 20 years ago. It was 2005. Russian and American relations were actually okay. We have George W. Bush leading the war on terror and Russia working with the United States. But the relations between Russia and the United States were about to take a negative turn because 2008 was just around the corner. And 2008, just around the corner, had significant economic impacts as well. 20 years ago, approximately, one could say was the end of the honeymoon following the Cold War. Here we see George W. Bush being quite friendly with a young Vladimir Putin who had recently become the leader of Russia. Children born around this time are just reaching young adulthood right now. Well, that's 20 years ago. What about 40 years ago? Well, 40 years ago was the Cold War. Russia and Ukraine was one country, and Germany was two different countries. For the older people alive today, this was not that long ago. It was relatively recently in human history. But to those who are younger right now, the idea of a Soviet Union existing, of Germany being two different countries, East Germany and West Germany, it just seems like a far away and strange and foreign world. The Cold War had been going on for, 40 years by that point. In 1985, Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and started enacting reforms that gave people and republics more liberties. Reagan was the President of the United States. Both of them depicted here. But 40 years ago, what did the people then think 40 years ago looked like to them? Well, 40 years from 40 years ago was 80 years ago, and that was 1944. This picture is actually from 1943, I believe, but close enough. 1944, the end of it, approaching 1945, was the Second World War. Now this photo is from a little bit earlier than 80 years ago. It's the meeting of the leaders of the Allies in Tehran. Why did they meet in Tehran? Because that was considered a stable and safe place for the three leaders of the Allies to meet. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Just like today, 1985 seems recent to older people and a weird and strange distant world to younger people. Well, in 1945 seemed distant and strange to younger people, but rather recent to older people. The Soviet Operation Bagration had dealt a crushing blow to Nazi military, and the Allies from the West had landed in Normandy. From both East and West, the Nazi Empire was being squeezed, and it wouldn't be long before the Soviet military and the Western democracy militaries would meet, cracking the Nazi Empire in two. Well, that's exactly what happened. This was 80 years ago, one cycle ago, one wavelength ago. And it really defined our era. When people look at wars or disliked leaders during modern times, they always compare it to World War II and to Hitler. History has no shortage of tyrants and no shortage of wars. And yet, people compare it specifically to World War II and specifically to Hitler. Why? Well, to draw an effective comparison, one has to know history very well, and most people don't. But even if they don't know history very well, they still know about World War II. They still know about Hitler. They still know about the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. Even in our science fiction, we think of all these futuristic technologies, but the scariest human weapon is still nuclear weapons. In futuristic science fiction, the scariest weapon is a technology that's about 80 years old. So, to understand our era, we really need to understand the beginning, the defining moment of this era. What did things look like one wavelength ago? What did things look like in 1945? To understand 2025. And an optimist would say, well, in 1945, peace broke out, to quote Monty Python. So we can expect the same in 2025. But a pessimist would say, well, the entire Second World War was 6 years. And when we're dealing with 80-year cycles and such broad approximations like what we made at the beginning, plus or minus 6 years really isn't that significant. So maybe 2025 is not going to be the end of global conflict, but the beginning. But either way, the pessimist and optimist agree that around 1945 is a significant year to understand in order to understand the world we live in today. But before we leave, we're going to look at one more year. And that year is 1865. Why 1865? Well, that's 80 years before 80 years ago. If we want to understand our era, we have to understand 1945. And to do that, we have to understand the mindset of people in 1945. And to do that, we have to understand what was 80 years ago for them. What was an era-defining period for them? What was one wavelength ago for them? Well, for them, it would have been 80 years before 1945. It would have been 1865. What did we have then? Well, we had the process of German unification, only to end 80 years later with the end of the Second World War. What a coincidence. We also had the American Civil War, which was coming to an end. And we also had a mathematician publish a work which would become world famous, The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland. So, one of my New Year's resolutions is to learn more about what the world was like in 1865. I wish you a Happy New Year. Until next time, enjoy.